As I was saying before the children left, we can see a linear, visible history in our hallway. But there are many stories and lessons to learn about our history that also give us a glimpse of the women and men who played a part in establishing this church. There may be some people in this room who don't know a lot about our history. If there's anybody watching on streaming, or maybe catching this after the service and they see this on YouTube, they may not know anything about our church and our history. So I wanted to share a few excerpts from Len Denison's history of the first 25 years of UUCA. A small group of newcomers to the Aiken area, primarily from the new Savannah River plant, formed the Aiken Fellowship in 1953. Several Augusta couples traveled to the Aiken Fellowship to attend services there, some having attended Unitarian churches in other communities prior to moving to Augusta. An instant friendship formed among the Augustans. They began to get together socially in each other's homes, and soon they decided to form a fellowship in Augusta. They obtained advice from the national office and the Aiken Fellowship, and in July 1954, they held an organizational meeting around the dining room table of Peggy and Don Kelly, where 12 people signed the membership book. The first regular meeting was conducted in August at the Walton Way Temple. The early attenders were a mix of Southerners and those from other parts of the country, with only one being a native Augustan. Most people who came to visit were described as seekers. Some stayed and some didn't. Most of the early members were young, middle class, and just beginning their careers. Most of the women were mothers of small children and did not work outside the home. The members were energetic, interested in many things, and wanted to get things done. Sound familiar? Having a religious education program for the children was a high priority. One reason was that the children were frequently asked in school if they went to church or Sunday school. Both the children and parents wanted to be able to say yes. At first, parents took turns carpooling their children to the Aiken Fellowship for Sunday school. By the second year, the number of children had increased, and interest in having a religious education program in Augusta increased as well. In the fall of 1956, Sunday school was held at the Augusta Church for the first time, with 31 children in attendance. Due to the religious education classes, one mother described her young son as confident in his minority beliefs when discussing religion with his friends. There was an interest in getting involved in social projects, and several of the members were active with the Mental Health Association. In 1955, a project increased the small library for the patients at the Milledgeville State Mental Hospital. Church members shipped 1,000 hardcover books, 600 pocket-sized books, and several thousand magazines to them, greatly increasing its original 600-book collection. And our tradition of providing assistance to needy Augusta families at Christmas first occurred in 1959, when children were asked to bring gifts of food wrapped in white to give away. Near the end of the 1950s, the membership voted to have open membership for all races. Some were concerned about what effect it may have on the members and membership growth, even though there was no question of the outcome. One member resigned because of his concerns about the effect of an open membership on his practice. Even so, it would be several years before an African American would attend regularly. The annual meeting, the last meeting of the church year, was held each May before the summer recess, and the church was only open during the school year and closed during the summer in those times. Despite a membership of only 30 members, in 1955, there was a dual slate for the election of officers. By 1959, there was a full contingent of committees, with the executive committee appointing chairs for program, religious education, finance, building, publicity, and membership committees. And just to give you an idea, expenses were minimal at first, and the 1957 fiscal year expenses were $710. So there was a budget for $1,250 in 1959, And it was calculated that the average pledge per family needed to be $1.39 per week, or a recommendation of 20 cents per $1,000 of income. The first rummage sale was done in March 1958. Proceeds went to the building fund. Betty Hostetler remembers that we spent one whole day a week from May until October making yo-yos for our yo-yo quilt, which we were going to auction. She said we had no idea when we started that we'd make hundreds of yo-yo circles before we had enough for a quilt. And they only made about $400, but they had enough to buy curtains for the meeting room and darken the room. That would darken the room to show slides. And they also bought a large coffee pot, which is invaluable for you congregations. The New Fellowship had 5 meeting places in its first 5 years. I mentioned the Walton Way Temple. They met in a ballet school. They met in the old government house on Telfair Street, the Academy of Music, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which was terrible because they smoked and they drank coffee, and neither of those were allowed. So that didn't last long. By 1957, there was a building fund, and my final story is just wonderful. It's the story of the beginning of the building fund. Several of the church members were sitting around a kitchen table drinking coffee with B.J. Annis and her husband one evening when they decided the wandering had gone on long enough. Each one pulled out a bill from their billfold and threw it onto the table to start the building fund right then. Don Kelly, one of the members there that night, was an architect, and he sketched out a potential building on a brown paper bag. And the rest is history. Legacy is potential made real. What we see as someone's legacy is the result of their hard work, their vision, their dreams for the future, their scribbling on a brown paper bag. The opposite is also true. We can waste the promise of the future and instead cause needless damage. When we hear a reading like the Thich Nhat Hanh address to Mother Earth, we can see how time and again we have to rely on her ability to repair her equilibrium, because our legacy has not been one of caring for the earth, but of making a mess of it time after time throughout our history of life on this planet. The Reverend Anna Levy-Lyons writes that the God of the Hebrew Scriptures isn't quite so loving and nurturing. She reminds us that the Genesis text introduces the flood story by saying, "And God regretted having made humankind in the earth. And God's heart grieved, and God said, I'll wipe out the creature whom I've created from the face of the earth, from human to animal to creeping thing, and to the bird of the skies, because I regret that I made them." If you've never read that passage from the book of Genesis, it is truly shocking. But God, of course, does not carry out that threat totally. Even though he sends a flood, he spares Noah and his family to be witnesses and to be responsible for building the earth back from the brink of extinction. And I've preached before about how Noah was a person who had a lot of issues. He is no Christ figure, but just a man with an ark full of smelly animals. Among other things we learn about him is that with all our flaws, we can strive like he did to make a difference. Reverend Lyons says, "It is only through the actions of imperfect people, willing to take responsibility for cleaning up a mess that we did not make, that life can be saved." Our legacy, then, comes from those who have gone before us. And one of the most important things we have in our Unitarian Universalist tradition that has come to epitomize our faith tradition is the covenant. Just as God made a covenant with Noah not to destroy the earth again, so we make a promise to stay with one another in the practice of our faith, not to walk away, but to try time after time, though we've broken our vows 1,000 times, to stay in covenant and work out our problems, to face what wounds we have inflicted upon each other and try to heal. That is hard work. It is noble work. It is ultimately saving work. And it is a gift, a legacy from our spiritual forebears that we are blessed to have. Alice Blair Wesley, the UU historian, says that entrance into the covenantal community summons a lifelong forbearing engagement of heart, mind, and body. Choosing to enter into covenant with other people in a congregation to make such a promise begins with choosing to walk through the doors of a faith community again for the first time in a long time. It continues when we choose to try again after betrayal, when we choose to trust each other, though each of us knows the anguish of broken trust, when we choose to love each other instead of fear each other. Being in covenant with one another, she says, means that we promise that we will engage our hearts and minds and bodies on this adventure of the Spirit that we are taking together. It means that we promise to do our best to do what love asks of us and to live together with the integrity of faithful love. We pride ourselves on being a congregation that values free faith. What is free faith? It's not, as many people venture, the freedom to believe whatever you want. Rather, it is the legacy of our forebears who came from Europe seeking the ability to gather together not under a common creed, but voluntarily becoming a community by promises we make to each other. The Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, our UUA president, writes, "We sometimes wrongly say it is the absence of creed that is most important to who we are as Unitarian Universalists. This is wrong. Any one of us could practice religious freedom at home on Sunday mornings. We could practice religious freedom all day long, every day, and never come into community. It is covenant that brings us out of isolation, out of selfish concerns, out of individualism, to join ourselves to something greater, to become part of a community that is working to practice love, to dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and wisdom together, to find better ways to live our lives and live in the world. This is sacred religious work." So we have here a microcosm and macrocosm of legacy to consider this morning. How do we live up to what we have been given between ourselves in this community, as well as in the interconnectedness of all existence? The Reverend Megan Lloyd Joyner writes that her congregation's covenant guides our walk together as we seek to be our best selves within and beyond our walls. Surely that is what our covenant calls us to do as well. And on this Commitment Sunday, when we recognize that our generosity today will leave a legacy for our children, I invite us all to join in reading aloud the covenant that is always on the back of our order of service. To honor our commitment to each other and this congregation, we covenant to treat each other with respect and dignity. We will build on this foundation to communicate with kindness and support, accept responsibility for our individual acts, serve the congregation with compassion and commitment, freely explore our values and those of others, honor our diversity as a source of communal strength, and be open to having others call us back to being in covenant when we fail to live up to these standards. May we be the ones who make it so. Blessed be. Amen. Ashe.